Joining us now, Washington correspondent for Spectrum News, Kevin Frey. Kevin, it's rare that we get to see the House live at this hour, and yet 2 mornings in a row, it's starting to get spoiled. But talk us through what we're watching right now and what we expect to unfold over the course of this hour, because we think this vote could actually come sometime by the time our show is on the air and not even done.
Yeah, I mean, so we're in the middle of this kind of final last hurdle of debate.
Yeah.
And this is really the last hurrah for both sides to make their case. There could be some mischief that, as the Republicans would like to label, anything the Democrats might try to do in the next half hour in terms of procedural votes and procedural actions. But at this point, we're barreling toward this vote. And if Johnson's projection is true, that he gave overnight, that they could lose 1 or 2 votes, that would still be enough of a margin, albeit the thinnest of possible margins, for them to get this bill across the finish line.
I think that's exactly right. And we finally got that long-awaited manager's amendment. Only us in D.C. would call that long-awaited. But that's basically the thing that shows what concessions and compromises the Speaker had to make in getting all of these various factions of his conference actually on board. What are some of those?
Yes, so I mean, look, we have basically 2 opposing sides on both extreme ends of the coalition. You had the more moderate members from traditionally blue states that were looking to shield Medicaid from extreme cuts, but at the same time, they wanted to increase, for example, the state and local tax deduction availability for some of their wealthier constituents. And quite frankly, these are more expensive states to live in. And so it's kind of these compounding factors. That all costs more money. Then you also have a coalition that wanted deeper cuts. So they wanted deeper cuts to Medicaid. They didn't want to expand SALT. They wanted to roll in some of these green energy tax cuts. And so you combine those 2 factions. This is a bit of a balancing act for leadership. And so you have seen, as part of this amendment, they expanded that SALT deduction to keep people happy, but they also at the same time sped up the rollout of work requirements on Medicaid. They sped up the elimination of some of these green energy tax cuts. And so the balancing act continues. You've seen some moderates not happy with some of the changes that were made to appease the conservatives and vice versa.
And vice versa. But they do seem, at this point at least, like they have some of the votes. And one of the members of the SALT caucus seen sitting right there, Mike Lawler, on his phone in the House chamber. But talk a little bit about what this means for Mike Johnson. I've heard regularly from Republicans on the Hill who feel like every time Johnson comes up to a tough barrier in the legislating process, he's always able to get it over the finish line. They feel like he doesn't get enough credit for that. But what's the lesson here if we look at Mike Johnson able to navigate this phase of the process over the finish line? And I say this phase because this bill's coming back around to the House, and it's going to look very different once the Senate is done with it.
Right. I mean, it's kind of the going moniker that, like, don't underestimate Mike Johnson. He's a very soft-spoken, very polite Louisiana legislator. At the same time, up until this point, yes, he has gotten things done, but these have been largely procedural steps, keeping the government open, passing through a framework that didn't have a lot of specifics that could piss a lot of people off. Now we're down to the actual legislating, the rubber is hitting the road. If he's able to pull this off, that's a big win for him in terms of navigating a very thin-margined, fractious caucus. But one also has to say that the president really had to come in to whip those votes and basically knock some heads together earlier this week. Now, that's not an unusual role for the president to play by any means. But there's a lot of whip, as Congressman Jeffries once described it, the whip operation was run out of the White House, not from Capitol Hill.
And I think that's actually borne out to be true. The fact that Trump was at the Capitol, 2 days ago now, whipping those votes, and then also had Freedom Caucus members at the White House yesterday haggling through the final points of this. And I think it's important, you and I have talked about this before, Trump is not someone who wants to dig into the weeds on policy. He has been pretty clear. He just wants a win, and he just wants as many of his priorities in here as possible. So now turn to the Senate and how they might change this in a way that either Trump likes or doesn't, because I could see it a few ways.
Right. I mean, the prime example would be Senator Hawley, who is very much not happy with the idea of major cuts to Medicaid. And so he's going to be pushing those back. And again, it's another matter of margins. There's not a lot of votes to spare in the Senate either. And so if he is able to rein in some of the reductions to Medicaid, that might not be something that Trump is necessarily willing to oppose or get upset about. He might actually embrace some of that.
Yeah, based on what he said to the House members.
Based on what he said to the House members, and also the mere fact that, yes, that will impact his constituencies, the MAGA base, if Medicaid is rolled into extensively. And on top of that, it kind of beats against the populist message that MAGA has tried to kind of propagate as being their way of operating.
Yeah, I think that's an important piece, and it brings us into the political realm, too, which is the idea that by putting some of these Medicaid cuts and work requirements into effect earlier, that's something that Johnson was able to do to placate the hardline conservative members, many of them Freedom Caucus members. Yeah. And yet it also means that this now becomes an issue where people are losing their Medicaid coverage before the 2028 midterms. It now squarely makes it a political issue, as if it wasn't already.
Yeah, they move it up to 2026, I believe, the end of next year. And so, yes, you could start seeing people falling off coverage.
The 2026 midterms and the 2028 presidential.
You start seeing people, it's 5 a.m. You could start seeing people fall off before the midterms. But critically, in that 2-year span between the midterms and the presidential election, and you can already see the Democratic ads being written at this time, saying so many people have lost coverage. These people are not able to, get food assistance. They can't eat. And the marginalized are in dire straits. That's going to be the Democratic message. It already is. It's proving out on the floor as we speak right now, but that's going to be really amped up heading into the election.
While you and I started the segment, we heard Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley speaking exactly about that. That is what all of these Democrats who are speaking on the floor are highlighting. And frankly, it's borne out by the things that the Congressional Budget Office has estimated. They say that it could be more than 8 million people off of Medicaid by the time that this bill period is covered, so over a 10-year period. On SNAP, food assistance programs, it could be 2+ million people who are left without food assistance.
And Democrats got another kind of talking point from one of these CBO reports just within the last 24 hours, where one basically said very plainly that the top 10% are going to see an increase in their overall financial means, and the lower 10%, the poorest folks in America, will see their general means go down.
Yeah, exactly. So all of that underscored by the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. Kevin Frey, stick around. We're going to check back in with you later because this is going to be rolling all through our hour, and we're tracking this morning's vote on the House floor, of course. Sitting here on set with me, Washington correspondent for Spectrum News, Kevin Frey, still up there on the screen. Leader Hakeem Jeffries, the top Democrat. Finishing up the Democratic debate portion of this bill, we know what a lot of those concerns are from Democrats. And frankly, it's them just reading the Congressional Budget Office score or predicted impact of what this legislation will do. It will balloon further the national debt. It will mean people losing their health care coverage. It will mean people having less access to food assistance programs. What else have we heard from the leader during these final remarks?
Well, and there's also the concern, and he hit on this a little bit, basically saying, as part of his remarks a few moments ago, that nursing homes will close. There is the concern of the ripple effect of, for example, some of the Medicaid rollbacks, and what could that mean for the financing of rural hospitals in some of these rural communities, which then by proxy would be hurting some of Trump's own voter base just based on where they live. And so that is another kind of component of this argument we're hearing from Democrats. Largely, this fits into kind of the framing that they have been using to approach this debate from the beginning, and quite frankly, the Trump presidency writ large, which is that he's not for you, he's for the billionaire class, he's for the Elon Musks of the world, as opposed to looking out for you, the middle-class voter, and that's what we're going to do. Now, Jeffries has promised over the next 100 days or so to offer lots of ideas and kind of their own optimistic, forward-looking agenda. We're still waiting to see what those component pieces are. But at least for the moment, this bill, provided it passes, and again, it will go through many iterations over the next couple months on the Hill, it undergirds their central theme that they've adopted as seemingly the Democratic message heading into the midterms.
And then, of course, there's the Republican dynamics, because you used that very important word of if this thing passes. And we expect that it will. I don't think that for a bill of this level of importance, politically and legislatively, that Johnson would leave much to chance here. But he can lose 3 Republican votes. Again, the story of slim majorities. But we already know that one of them, and it's the man that we showed at the top of this segment, Thomas Massie of Kentucky, is an absolute no. He's been vocal about that.
And this is not a surprise. He votes against pretty much everything that is of substantial size like this because of his concerns. He is consistent on the debt and deficit.
Exactly. But then there are others. And specifically, I'm thinking about Chip Roy. We heard the speaker say that there might be 2 no votes. You and I, during the commercial break, were like, wait, who's the second? We don't know anyone who's firm. But I think it's notable that Chip Roy, who sits on the Rules Committee, was absent when the Rules Committee voted this out to send it to the full House floor. Does that tell us anything here? Might he take a walk and not be on the floor? I mean, what do you expect?
Well, and there's an irony to that, too, in that his vote, yes or no, would not have been enough to derail it in the Rules Committee, but it does allow him to stand on principle to say that I wasn't involved in this one way or the other. He's certainly one of the folks we're keeping an eye on, and part of it is because he has a similar argument, which is he's concerned about what this will do to the federal debt and deficit. This has been kind of the raison d'etre for Republicans for some time now. And as part of the debate throughout the course of the night, I don't know what hour it was, someone essentially was arguing, one of the Democrats were saying, you're only ever concerned about the debt and deficit when a Democrat is in the White House. So you have the Chip Roys, who's very consistent on this issue.
Yeah.
There's another lawmaker, Warren Davidson of Ohio, who has been also voicing concern about what this will do to the country's finances. He is apparently, according to some of our colleagues on the Hill, not been saying one way or the other throughout the course of the night where he'll be landing on this bill. So those are kind of the key members to watch. But again, if it's 2 or 3, if there's full attendance, I know I keep adding ifs, but if all of those component parts come into place, it'll be enough to get this passed.
That sounds right. Sounds like the right landscape to be considering here. And again, as we're watching the House floor, what we expect to see is now that Leader Jeffries seemed to be wrapping up there, or at least close to it with the applause from his colleagues, we will then see Speaker Mike Johnson. We will then see them do what's called a motion to recommit, which is Democrats making one last procedural attempt to stop this bill. And then the final passage vote will happen. We'll be watching that on this show on Morning Joe coming up. We will bring it to you live as it happens, because it's rare that lawmakers are keeping way too early hours. Kevin, we appreciate that you were doing the same.